June 6, 1944, the morning of D-Day. Inside a damp bunker along the Normandy coast, a German soldier presses ear against cold concrete. He expected to hear the crack of rifles or the grind of tank treads. But instead, the sound came first as a faint vibration, low and steady. Within seconds, it grew into a rolling thunder. The bunker shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. The man whispered, not about the American soldiers who would soon storm the beaches, but about something far more terrifying. Die Amerikanische Himmel, the American sky. In that moment, the Germans on the coast did not fear the infantry rushing toward them on the sand. They feared what loomed overhead. Before the war, the Germans had good reason to feel confident. Their blitzkrieg tactics, lightning-fast armored assaults supported by Stuka bombers, had crushed Poland, France, and much of Europe in a matter of months. To the German soldier in 1940, the Luftwaffe was invincible. The United States, meanwhile, was written off as a nation of factory workers and moviegoers. Hitler dismissed American industry as weak, sneering that the U.S. could never build modern airplanes in serious numbers. Luftwaffe Commander Hermann Göring, famously arrogant, declared that no enemy bomber can reach the Ruhr. If one ever does, you can call me Meyer. But history has a sense of irony. By 1943, the nation of factory workers was producing nearly 100,000 aircraft a year. Factories in Detroit, Chicago, and Seattle roared day and night, churning out bombers and fighters in a volume that no European power could dream of matching. Germany, once boasting the most feared air force in the world, was producing only a fraction of that number. Barely 30,000 in 1944, most of them rushed into service without trained pilots or fuel. The German soldiers who once mocked American softness now looked to the skies with dread, because they knew, if the Americans found you, there was no place to hide. The first hints of this fear began in North Africa. In 1942, at battles like Kasserine Pass, German troops ridiculed the green American infantry. They were right. The Americans were inexperienced, poorly coordinated, and were often driven back by Rommel's hardened Afrika Korps. But one thing shocked the Germans: the speed at which American planes seemed to multiply. Within months, skies that had once belonged to the Luftwaffe were crowded with American fighters and bombers. German supply convoys were shredded by strafing runs from P-40 Warhawks and P-38 Lightnings. A German officer bitterly admitted, "We no longer move without expecting them. The desert belonged to their planes." In Italy, the pressure only mounted. As German divisions tried to hold the mountainous terrain south of Rome, American bombers relentlessly struck rail lines and bridges. Trains loaded with ammunition would vanish in fiery explosions before reaching the front. Soldiers recalled skies so dense with silver bombers that they seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. One Italian civilian described it as a ceiling of metal above us. German commanders quickly learned that moving men or tanks by daylight was suicide. They shifted to night marches, creeping forward under darkness, only to be stalled again when American planes returned with the sunrise. By 1944, when the Allies invaded Normandy, the transformation was complete. Germany's blitzkrieg machine had always depended on fast movement, coordinated strikes, and supply chains that kept armor rolling. But none of that mattered when the skies above were enemy territory. German tank crews reported abandoning vehicles after hearing the distant roar of engines, not even waiting to see the aircraft. The psychological toll was enormous. One diary entry from a German private in France reads, "Every time we moved by day, the sky punished us. Our tanks burned not by enemy hands, but by the sun that carried their bombers." Numbers tell the story with brutal clarity. In 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces could dispatch bomber raids of more than 1,000 planes in a single day. Over Germany, daylight raids became so massive that civilians compared them to migrating flocks of birds that never ended. Each aircraft carried thousands of pounds of bombs, and behind them swarmed long-range escorts. The sleek P-51 Mustang, with its bubble canopy and deadly speed. German pilots, once the elite knights of the air, now describe themselves as hunted prey. The testimonies from both sides are striking. German ace Adolf Galland confessed, "We were fighting with a roof over our heads that was collapsing." The Luftwaffe was no longer the shield it had once been. It was full of holes. U.S. pilots wrote letters home marveling at the sight of German soldiers, simply abandoning trucks, carts, even horses at the first sight of fighters circling overhead. An infantryman on the ground might have shrugged at artillery fire. Something familiar, survivable. But the scream of diving aircraft turned hardened soldiers into trembling figures crouched in ditches. Of course, fear was sometimes disguised as humor. German propaganda tried to ridicule American bombing crews, calling them Luftgangsters. But the nickname, meant to mock, carried a grudging respect. Like gangsters, the Americans seemed to show up everywhere, armed to the teeth, leaving destruction in their wake. Some German troops muttered bitter jokes about needing umbrellas, not helmets. Others joked darkly that the safest place in Europe was inside an American bomber, because there were simply too many of them for all to be shot down. Still, the laughter was thin. What truly haunted the Germans was a sense of inevitability. You could dig trenches against artillery. You could armor tanks against machine gun fire. But against the sheer weight of American air power, there was no defense. A soldier might survive one raid, or even two, but the raids never stopped. Day after day, the sky filled again. It wasn't a single explosion that terrified. It was a relentless drumbeat, the certainty that another wave was already on the way. And this fear reshaped the German war effort itself. Armored divisions that might have struck at Allied lines sat immobilized, too vulnerable to move. Supply columns traveled only at night, creeping through forests like hunted animals. Commanders who once dreamed of sweeping offensives now measured success by how long they could hide from the sky. By the summer of 1944, many German officers admitted openly that the battlefield no longer belonged to tanks, artillery, or even men. It belonged to the air. For the German soldier crouched in Normandy, listening to thunder above, this was the new reality of war. It wasn't courage or cowardice that decided survival. It was whether the American sky had found you that day. And as the war dragged on, those skies only grew darker. What the Germans did not yet know on June 6th was that the thunder above Normandy was only the beginning. The real storm was still to come. February 3rd, 1945, the heart of Berlin. A young German boy remembers the first distant hum, a faint vibration like bees gathering in the distance. At first, it seemed harmless, almost curious. But within minutes the hum became a roar, and the roar became thunder. The ground trembled as the American bombers arrived. In a matter of hours, entire city blocks were turned into ruins. The child would later say that what terrified him most was not the flames, not even the collapse of buildings. It was the sound of engines. For many Germans by 1945, the war had become a battle not against men with rifles, but against the sky itself. By this stage, Germany's Luftwaffe was only a shadow of the mighty force it had once been. The proud air arm that had once dominated Europe in 1939 and 1940 had been bled dry. Oil shortages crippled the ability to fly. Factories were bombed so frequently that replacement aircraft rolled off assembly lines in halves and pieces. Skilled pilots had been lost in earlier battles over Britain and Russia, leaving fresh-faced teenagers with only a few hours of flight training to replace them. And the Americans, once dismissed as amateurs, now owned the skies. Goring, once so boastful, now muttered bitterly that the Americans had beaten him with nothing but overwhelming numbers and relentless persistence. The transformation was not only technological, it was psychological. For years, the German army had believed in its invincibility. Soldiers had marched across Europe, supported by their Luftwaffe comrades who screamed down in their Jew 87 Stukas, terrifying enemies into submission. But by 1944 and 1945, that narrative had flipped. It was the Germans who now felt the dread of aircraft diving overhead. The roles of predator and prey had been reversed. The Americans wielded air power with both precision and brute force. Strategic bombing campaigns hit Germany's industrial backbone with unrelenting ferocity. Factories at Schweinfurt, vital for producing ball bearings, were struck repeatedly. Hamburg endured a firestorm that killed tens of thousands. Dresden, though controversial, was reduced to ash. Railroads, bridges, and fuel depots were systematically obliterated. For the German soldier at the front, this meant something painfully simple. No fuel for tanks, no ammunition for artillery, no reinforcements arriving in time. The army was being starved not by soldiers on the ground, but by the bombers above. On the battlefield, American air power was even more terrifying. The P-47 Thunderbolt, nicknamed the Jug, was an armored Brua plane notorious for swooping down to strafe German columns with machine guns and rockets. Its cousin, the P-51 Mustang, was sleek and lethal, escorting bombers deep into German territory and hunting down Luftwaffe planes that dared to rise. Survivors spoke of convoys shredded on open roads, tanks disabled before they could fire a shot, horses and carts, the last resort of the German army, scattered and burning in fields. One German infantryman later recalled, "We stopped asking where the Americans were. We asked, where aren't they?" The statistics were staggering. By late 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces were flying more than 200,000 sorties per month over Europe. Oil production in Germany collapsed, dropping by more than 90% after a series of devastating raids on refineries in Ploesti, Luna, and elsewhere. Without fuel, tanks sat abandoned in forests. Without railroads, troops went hungry at the front. Some divisions retreated not because they were defeated in combat, but because they simply ran out of supplies to fight. For the German soldier, this was a cruel joke. They had the discipline, the experience, even the will to fight, but no fuel for their tanks, no ammunition for their guns, and skies that seemed to hate them. The testimonies from Germany's own leaders reflected this despair. Hermann Göring himself reportedly admitted after the war, "When I saw American fighters over Berlin, I knew the war was lost." Galland, the famous fighter ace, described it as a war waged under a roof that was collapsing, and ordinary soldiers echoed this sentiment in their diaries. One wrote in February 1945, "We hide in barns. We cover our vehicles with branches. We march only at night. Still, they find us. The planes always find us." For the Americans, the dominance of the skies was both a military strategy and a symbol. To U.S. pilots, it felt like proof of what their country could achieve, a union of industry, manpower, and willpower. The arsenal of democracy had turned into the fortress of the skies. For German soldiers, it was something far darker. Every hum of engines overhead was a reminder that their leaders had overreached, that their empire was crumbling, and that even the bravest soldier on the ground was helpless without protection above. Despite the terror, humor crept in, bitter and ironic. American B-17 bombers were nicknamed Flying Fortresses for their resilience. German soldiers, watching endless waves pass overhead, called them Flying Cities. A few joked grimly that their army should replace steel helmets with umbrellas. Others quipped that their air force had been reduced to fighting in museums, since most planes were hidden in barns, camouflaged in forests, or simply destroyed before they could leave the ground. The jokes were sharp, but they came from men who knew the truth. They were outmatched, and they would never regain control of the skies. This change reshaped the entire German worldview. In the early years of the war, heroism had meant charging forward with tanks and artillery, conquering vast lands in a matter of weeks. By 1945, heroism for many Germans meant something smaller, surviving another day under skies filled with bombers. The myth of German invincibility, built carefully by propaganda, had collapsed. What remained was fatigue, resignation, and a deep awareness that the future would be written not by them, but by the planes they could no longer stop. The contrast was painful. At the start of the war, the Luftwaffe had been Germany's pride, its Stukas screaming in terror over helpless enemies. By the end, children in Berlin cowered in basements as American B-17s passed overhead, and soldiers marched at night like shadows, hoping the bombers would miss them. The symbolism was unavoidable. The Reich that had once claimed to command the skies now hid from it. As Germany collapsed in the spring of 1945, the roar of American engines became the soundtrack of defeat. In ruined cities, civilians covered their ears as wave after wave passed overhead. On country roads, retreating soldiers looked up with dread at the glint of silver wings. And in Führer bunker itself, even Hitler could hear the distant thunder, a constant reminder that his empire was shrinking by the hour. For the Germans, The end did not come only through Soviet tanks or Allied infantry. It came from the sky. It came in the endless drone of engines, in the shadows cast by formations so vast they blotted out the sun, in the bitter knowledge that no matter how bravely they fought on the ground, the sky was lost. When surrender came in May 1945, many German soldiers felt a strange relief, not only because the war was finally over, but because the sound of engines would stop. The endless thunder above, the one enemy they could never shoot down or outfight, had finally fallen silent. The legacy of that fear is telling. Even decades later, veterans spoke less about their duels with Allied tanks or their firefights in ruined cities. They spoke instead of the sky. The sound of bombers, the glint of Mustangs, the helplessness of seeing comrades scattered by rockets. They remembered that above all else, it was the American sky they feared most. In the end, German troops faced many enemies, British soldiers, Soviet armies, partisans, hunger, cold. But none struck more deeply, none carried the same inevitability as the United States Air Force. The Reich did not simply fall to tanks and rifles. It surrendered to the endless, inescapable roar above.